Welcome, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar discussing why pressuring Israel to intervene in Russia's Ukraine war is misguided and dangerous. I'm Laurie Regan, Emmett's New York chapter president and executive and advisory board member, and I'm looking forward to our conversation with Jonathan Tobin on this important and timely subject. As most of you know, Emmett is an unabashedly pro-Israel, pro-America think tank, and our work is critically important at these extremely precarious times. As the need for foreign policy leaders to understand the complexities of the geopolitical realities of the Middle East and beyond, we work tirelessly to educate lawmakers, and our work cannot be done without your support. As Giving Tuesday approaches at the end of this month, I encourage you all to act early and to please visit our website at www.emmettonline.org to make a financial donation. Our weekly webinars featuring esteemed experts and panelists, as well as our work on the Hill, needs your support, and I thank you for that. Today's webinar will be recorded and available for viewing in the coming days. Please feel free to pass the link on to others who would appreciate the work that we do and the insights that Jonathan will be providing today. If you have any questions for Jonathan, please put them in the queue at the bottom of the screen using the Q&A function, not the chat, as I won't be monitoring that for questions. I'll try to get to as many of them as possible towards the latter part of the program, as always. Jonathan Tobin is editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, as most of us are familiar with, an international wire service covering the Jewish world and Israel. He's also a senior contributor for the Federalist and a columnist for Newsweek, the New York Post, Haaretz and Israel Hayom, as well as a regular contributor for other publications such as the Washington Examiner and Commentary magazine. He covers the American political scene, foreign policy, the U.S. Israel relationship, Middle East diplomacy, and the Jewish world. Previous to becoming editor of JNS, Jonathan was executive editor, senior online editor, and chief political blogger for Commentary magazine. He also served as editor-in-chief of the Jewish Exponent in Philadelphia and editor of the Connecticut Jewish Ledger. Jonathan has won more than 50 awards, including top columnist for Jewish publications 10 times, most recently in 2018 and 2019. He appears regularly on television commenting on politics in the United States and Israel, foreign policy and Jewish affairs, and lectures on college campuses and to Jewish communities. Welcome, Jonathan, and thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Laurie. It's great to be on with you. It's great to be on with Emmett, which is a great organization which does so much good advocacy work on behalf of Israel and pro-Israel causes and the U.S. Israel alliance. I encourage everyone to support it.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate it. And we always like working with you, Jonathan. In response to pressure from Ukrainian President Zelenskyy, as well as U.S. lawmakers who have been pressuring Israel to become more involved in the Russia-Ukraine war, you wrote a terrific column last week entitled, "Israel Should Stay Out of the War in Ukraine." And we're going to put a link to that column in the chat for everyone. I encourage you all to read it. In that article, you concluded, quote, "The idea that Israel should be dragged into this morass simply for the sake of a dubious romanticizing of the conflict to assert its status as a world power or any other reason is as irresponsible as it is reckless." There are a number of very sound reasons why Israel would not want to get involved in the war, including Russia's presence in Syria, Iran's nuclear program, and what Daniel Pipes described as essentially a massive hostage situation right now with 250,000 Jews in Russia. So when I hear politicians on both sides of the aisle argue that Israel is immorally shirking its responsibility to the people of Ukraine, it makes me furious because it's just not based on any kind of sound policy from Israel's national security standpoint. Can you discuss the geopolitical and national security issues for Israel, and in particular, Israel's relationship with Russia?
Yes, well, I think you've kind of framed the question correctly. Israel has a very complicated relationship with Russia. That said, of course, I think the state of Israel, the Israeli people, just as other people everywhere, were horrified by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, horrified by the atrocities that have gone on during the course of this war, horrified by, Russian President Vladimir Putin's very callous use of force in this manner, and would like to see the war end. Strictly speaking, Israel is not completely distanced from the war. From the very beginning, Israel has been supportive of Ukraine's right to exist, right to self-determination of the Ukrainian people. It opposes the invasion. It has sent tremendous amount of humanitarian aid to Ukraine. At great expense. It's also taken in refugees from the Ukraine. So it's done a lot. It's actually been very, very supportive of Ukraine. But that's not enough for Ukrainian President Zelenskyy and for many critics of Israel, who seem to think that Israel should just be joining the war, should be acting the way the United States has, in treating the territorial integrity of the Ukrainian state as an important foreign policy and defense priority for the state of Israel. But the thing is, that's not a priority for the state of Israel. Israel has to worry about its own security, about its own territorial integrity. And the truth is, Russia is not just some country, some nuclear power in Europe, as far as Israel is concerned. Russia is a neighbor, for all intents and purposes, of Israel, because Russian military forces occupy part of Syria on Israel's northern border. Russia intervened in the Syrian civil war along with its partner Iran to keep Bashar Assad's barbarous regime in power. It has naval and air force bases in Syria. It's a major player in the Middle East. Part of that is due to Putin's desire to recreate the old Tsarist or Soviet empires. But in point of fact, Israel has a modus vivendi with this military power on its borders. And what that has meant is that Putin has, unlike Iran, unlike Assad, Putin has an equivocal relationship with Israel. He's had fairly cordial relations with the state of Israel during his time. He has not been openly anti-Semitic. He's sort of the first Russian czar who doesn't seem to specifically hate Jews as much as he's a vicious authoritarian and a tyrant, and now an aggressor in a war. He's been willing to live and let live with Israel in terms of the Syrian-Israel border, and in fact, he gave the Israelis the okay to attack inside Syria, attack Iranian and Hezbollah and other terrorist targets that threaten Israel, because the Russians have no interest in aiding the Iranian or terrorist wars against Israel. Whatever Putin ultimately thinks about Israel, he has other priorities. He's not interested in fighting it. So Israel has an interest in keeping its northern border quiet. It has an interest in maintaining its access to the skies over Syria without Russian military interference. And that's a good reason for Israel not to be militarily involved in this war. That's something that a lot of Americans and maybe, some other people think is horrible, but of course Israel has to defend its own interests. What country doesn't? Israel has another interest in worrying about stepping too far into support of Ukraine, in that there are over 100,000 Jewish hostages inside of Russia. You quoted Daniel Pipes along that issue quite correctly. As I said before, Putin has not been hostile to the Jewish community in Russia. In fact, he allowed it to practice freely. It's never been so free, and in hundreds of in ever, except under Putin. That doesn't mean that Putin is a good guy. That doesn't mean he's not a tyrant, but he sort of protected the Jewish community. Now, the truth is, since the war started, that may have started to change. The Russian government has made threats against the ability of the Jewish agency to operate inside Russia. That's a real problem. It's placed pressure on Russian Jewish leaders. I think, the anti-Semitism that was long a part of sort of mainstream Russian culture is never far below the surface and is always ready to pop out again. So for Israel to basically go all in on supporting Ukraine, and basically joining this war in the way that the United States and other Western countries have, puts a Jewish community in peril. Whoever's running Israel, and we're speaking the day after an election in which it certainly appears that Benjamin Netanyahu will be coming back to the leadership of Israel. Likud and its allies have won a clear victory in the election. But Netanyahu's stance on this is not going to be any different than Yair Lapid or Naftali Bennett. He doesn't want to be drawn into a situation where Jews are going to be endangered, where Israel's security is going to be endangered by, joining a war that is not directly connected to Israel's national security. And if people don't like that, it's because they don't care about Israel's national security.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was a very insightful response covering a lot of ground. One of the other issues for Israel is its very rational fear that advanced military technology could fall into the hands of its enemies, meaning that Iran, for instance, if Russia were able to capture one of the Iron Dome batteries that Zelensky is requesting. In fact, I've read that Iran's drone program has advanced because it was able to capture a U.S. drone and use that technology to advance its own program. Israel also has production and supply limitations. It's facing Hezbollah and its 150,000 missiles together with Syria on its northern border. And of course, we know that Hamas starts a war every couple of years, not to mention Iran's other proxies in the region. It would be, in my view, insanity for Israel to give up any of its defensive weapons when we know that if Hezbollah were to start a war, Israel's defense systems would be overwhelmed. So why do you think Israel and her supporters are not more outspoken about the reasons why Israel cannot simply ship a bunch of Iron Dome batteries to Ukraine as if they're sitting in a warehouse unused? I mean, to be clear, Israel's been providing a tremendous amount of, as you point out, humanitarian aid, and they took in refugees, and they're now providing crucial intelligence relating to the Iranian suicide drones and helping Ukraine develop a missile alert system. So given all of this, you would think Zelensky should be grateful, but he's not, and I'm not sure about the messaging coming from Israel. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I think you're entirely right. The demands for sophisticated Israeli military equipment, even as I say, just its defensive equipment, is entirely unreasonable. Let's start with something, and I think that's, and the reason why, I think even American Jews, I gave a speech at a synagogue last weekend, and I was asked this, why can't the Israelis just send over some Iron Domes? I mean, and that would just be helpful, and it's just defensive weapons. It wouldn't be attacking Russians. Well, let's start with something, yes, Israel has Iron Dome batteries, but the notion that it has, 24 to spare or any to spare is absolutely nuts. Israel barely has enough. And indeed, if you speak to some within the, the security apparatus, they think they don't have enough. They need more. They don't need less. Coverage of, the truth is, if there were a war, if there were a war, and as you say, conflict with Hamas comes up, every 2 years. Actually, we had one in 2021, when we had another outbreak in 2022 earlier this year. Who knows when the next outbreak will come? Who knows when Hezbollah will decide it will try its luck with Israel? It threatened Israel's natural gas exploration activity off the coast as part of a blackmail to get with the United States to get Israel to make concessions to Lebanon. That's a whole different subject for perhaps another webinar. But it's not clear to me that Israel has sufficient coverage to fight on two fronts, to defend both, the South and the North. So the idea that Israel can give up any of its Iron Domes or any of its sophisticated military equipment is nuts. It's also true that it has, great fears about just dumping, its, high top secret stuff in Ukraine, putting it in, sort of hazard as hostages to the fortunes of war. That would not make sense for Israel. I'm not sure it entirely makes sense for the United States either, but that's a different question. Because the United States has made the determination to go all in and actually to strip America's own military of its reserves of missiles and other equipment. I mean, America has reduced its readiness in order to help Ukraine keep fighting this war, but that's an American decision. Israel has no, margin for error there. So again, that makes no sense. Why don't the Israelis speak of this? Why do so many American Jews think so? Well, I think we so often use the term regional military superpower with regard to Israel. We think of Israel's technology and its high-tech resources, its ability to defend its people against missiles from Hamas or other or Islamic Jihad, or as well as Hezbollah, we think of them as supermen, as if Israel is the United States. This is wrong. Israel's margin for error is not great. Its resources are not great. Yes, it is, thank God, more powerful than Hamas. It can defend its people against Hamas. It could defend itself against any regional military foes. Not that, a conventional war seems to be in the offing, certainly, hopefully not. But I think people have come to take Israeli defense and its defensive prowess for granted. I think certainly American Jews do. I mean, it's sort of the opposite of, 50 plus years ago when, Israel was under attack in 1967. And, people, certainly before those 6 days in June, I thought there was going to be another Holocaust. So we now think of, the Israelis as giants that are untouchable, unbeatable. And, I think we exaggerate its margin of error in terms of its defense capabilities. And I think Israelis are themselves loath to depict themselves as sort of, on the margins, and, that their security is, they like to think of their security as assured as well. And I think the truth is, as much as Israel is in a strong position, Israel is a strong country, it's militarily strong, but I think we can certainly buy in too much into that notion to the point where we think it could not merely defend itself, but fight a war or help another country fight a war elsewhere. And it can't.
Yeah, it does say a lot about the way the world views Israel and how that's changed in these past decades, as you point out. Senator Chris Murphy, the chair of the Senate subcommittee on the Middle East, announced that Israel needs to get off the sidelines and become a part of the community of democracies and stand up for Ukraine. Representative Michael Turner, who is the top-ranking Republican on the House Intelligence Committee and also serves on the House Armed Services Committee, told reporters that he was, quote, personally disappointed in Israel's decision. And Representative Adam Kinzinger, who can't retire soon enough, in my view, ignorantly announced that, quote, Israel is out of excuses to sit on the sideline and pretend it can't do anything, adding, okay, now this is getting old. Why is Israel so afraid? Hopefully not because of politics. Are you concerned that U.S. policymakers in very important positions for which you would expect some level of expertise on international affairs and geopolitical complexities seemingly lack any understanding of the difficulty of Israel's position?
Well, I think treating Chris Murphy or Adam Kinzinger as, American officials with a real clear grasp of foreign policy or defense issues on any front is not true. They don't know what they're talking about, no matter what the issue is, just to not to put too fine a point on it. But I think this speaks, especially what Kinzinger's line about, I hope it's not politics. Well, the truth is, all the virtue signaling about Ukraine is actually rooted in politics. The truth is, and I'll restate it again, sympathy for Ukraine is entirely appropriate. Opposition to the Russian invasion is appropriate. What Russia has done here is wrong. It's brutal. It should stop. It has committed war crimes, no question about it. But something has happened, that has somehow transformed Ukraine into sort of, the avatar of Western democracy. And it has very little to do with the actual Ukraine. It's sort of become, you quoted my article, it's been romanticized. Ukraine, the real Ukraine is not this sort of symbol of democracy that many in America seem to believe it is. And I think the reason why we've kind of gotten to this position has to do with American politics. Ukraine was bound up in the first effort to impeach Donald Trump in 2019 and 2020 because of his efforts to persuade Zelenskyy to investigate Biden family corruption in his country. The request as it was made was not entirely appropriate. The issue itself, though, is entirely relevant. I mean, and in fact, There was Biden family corruption. Hunter Biden's role in the Ukrainian energy industry was by itself, he got that job because of his father was vice president and in charge of Ukraine policy in the Obama administration. It was corrupt on its face. But, that became people sort of who hated Donald Trump, even though Donald Trump, I might add, was more supportive of Ukraine and gave more weapons to Ukraine than Obama did. Ukraine kind of got bound up in the never Trump moment in American politics. People began to see support for Ukraine as sort of analogous to opposition to Donald Trump. That has continued. Excuse me. Ukraine became somehow sort of the virtue signal moment. I mean, the blue and yellow flags on people's Facebook profiles. I mean, it became the successor to the vaccination symbol, vaccination logos, or the Black Lives Matter logo. Ukraine became a fashionable liberal cause. And, I'm not saying that sympathy for Ukraine is something that ought to be confined to liberals. It shouldn't. I think we should all be sympathetic. But it became, sort of a matter of sort of liberal politics. It became involved in how people thought about foreign policy. And I truly believe this, had Ukraine not been part of the sort of controversies with Donald Trump, I think the American reaction to the Russian invasion might, in earlier this year, might not have been all that different from the reaction to the Russian invasion of Eastern Ukraine and the Crimea in 2014 during the Obama administration, when in fact the United States did nothing. Ukrainian the territorial integrity of the Ukraine meant nothing to the United States in 2014, any more than the territorial integrity of the country of Georgia meant anything to the United States in 2008, or at least not much. But somehow Ukraine has become, sort of like Spain during the 1930s. It's a romance, and I think a lot of Americans want Israelis to sort of get with the program. And I think there are some Israelis who think that way too, because I think it's sort of a worldwide movement to sort of embrace Ukraine, to think of Volodymyr Zelenskyy as the next Winston Churchill. And there are many reasons, as I say, to sympathize with Ukraine, to admire what Zelenskyy has done. But the notion that Ukraine's, not just Ukraine's survival, and I think, because, people admire and rightly admire their ability to defend themselves against what is clearly an incompetent Russian military, I think people have come to believe that Ukrainian, not just survival, but Ukrainian victory is an American foreign policy priority. It's an international priority. And that's why I think some Democratic politicians like Murphy and never Trump Republicans about to be ex-congressmen like Kinzinger take this attitude that there's something wrong with Israel caring about its own security and not treating the Ukrainian cause as more important than their own country.
Yeah, I mean, there's a part of me that thinks this is the old typical, excuse to bash Israel once again, and this double standard. We don't see these people.
I think that's entirely right. Israel is always judged by a double standard, and that usually applies to false and libelous condemnations of Israeli measures of self-defense or its existence. Here again, Ukraine is just another excuse to bash Israel for those inclined to do so.
Yeah, which actually is a good transition to my next question, which is, so why do you think Zelenskyy is so obsessed with Israel as opposed to other Western and developed nations? I mean, you don't see him lashing out at Japan or Australia, for instance, for their lack of assistance. Do you think being Jewish plays a role in Zelenskyy's anger at Israel due to an emotional connection to the state? Or do you think that there could be an anti-Semitic component to this, given Ukraine's history, as well as the double standard on which Israel is being held? David Wormser of the Center for Security Policy suggested in a column that Ukraine needs Israeli support to help validate their positions as Jewish leaders. And he's also pointed out that Ukraine has never been a particularly good friend to Israel, including not moving its embassy to Jerusalem and its poor, if even hostile, voting record at the UN on matters pertaining to Israel. So as you discuss what motivates Zelensky, do you think Israel has any moral responsibility to the people of Ukraine, or are there other security reasons for Israel to help Ukraine? Outside of what we've just discussed, Zelensky did make the argument that Israel should join the fight because Russia is basically a terrorist nation, and this is a joint fight against terrorism.
I'll sort of take those in reverse. Certainly, Russia has been behaving like a terrorist nation towards Ukraine. It has not behaved like a terrorist nation, and certainly it committed atrocity along with Assad and Iran in Syria. But it is not related as a terrorist nation to Israel. So Israel, is not going to think that way. I think to take a deep dive into Zelensky's motivation here, first I'll say I don't think he feels any great connection to the state of Israel. This is not, he is Jewish. His parents are Jewish. He is open about the fact that he is of Jewish origin, but he is not. Sort of as my grandmother of blessed memory would have said, one of the Yiddish Yidden. He is not particularly Jewish in any other respect. And that was made very clear, crystal clear in his address to the Knesset, virtual speech to the Knesset earlier this year, when he had the chutzpah to say that Israel should stand united with Ukraine because the Ukrainian people had stood united with the Jewish people during the Holocaust. I can't think of anything that is a more, absurd and false, distortion of history. Of course, the Ukrainian people, we don't want to generalize, but overwhelmingly, they were supportive of the Holocaust, not supportive of the Jewish people. They were among the most enthusiastic collaborators with the Nazis during the German invasion of the Soviet Union, helping in atrocities like Babi Yar outside of Kyiv. The notion that they were, that there was Ukrainian solidarity with the Jews, the opposite was true. And I think had any other world leader, said what he had said, I mean, Polish leaders have said some things like that, and the reaction from Israelis, from the world Jewish community, from the international community was horror. How dare you falsify the history of the Holocaust? But Zelensky gets a pass because he's Zelensky, because he's, the 22 version of Winston Churchill. And he can get away with it somehow. I'm saying, really lying about that. Now, why did he lie about that? Well, because he's a product of, Soviet education. He's a product of, the old Soviet Union, which downplayed responsibility for the Holocaust on the part of the collaborators with the Nazis, which did not recognize, the truth about the Holocaust. And I think he just regurgitated that because he may not even know better. He certainly has no close connections with Israel. Now, why is he so focused on Israel? Because, well, I don't want to say it's anti-Semitic, although it certainly is a double standard. You're right, he doesn't do this to any other country. I think it relates to the fact that Israel looms large in the imagination of the West, of the world. The Jews were the boogeymen of Western literature, Western imagination for millennia. I think, sometimes it's most often worked against Jewish interests. Sometimes it worked for Jewish interests, as with the Balfour Declaration, when Britain's leaders really thought the Jews had the power to mobilize Russia and the United States behind the Allied war effort during World War I. That was an anti-Semitic myth, but one that helped the Jews in that one instance. And I think Zelensky thinks that Israel has more power. I think it has more influence. And, it's sort of oddly, just as Israel is judged as sort of the worst villain in the world by Israel bashers, I think, similarly, it sort of has this outsized reputation that somehow if the Israeli military, joins in the war, it will help them. It will validate their war. It's kind of detached from reality. But as it plays out, even if it may not be purposely anti-Semitic, in practice, singling Israel out in this way does smack of prejudice against Israel, of anti-Zionist sentiment. And it means judging Israel that, Israel has to fight, this war, that Israel must be more moral than any other nation. Israel must fight for the right everywhere rather than defending its own interests. And I think this is unfair to Israel and the Israelis, and kind of also speaks to some of the, manias and the sort of pathologies of thoughts about Jews in Israel, even among Ukrainians, and even among, in the mind of Ukraine's Jewish president. Now, of course, it's a good thing that Ukraine, I have to say, for Ukrainians to vote a Jew as their president, as they did a few years ago in electing Zelenskyy, is, an amazing, sort of turnaround in, Ukrainian history and culture. Because throughout the 20th century, and even before that, Ukrainian nationalism, which was stifled under the Soviets, has been linked with anti-Semitism. Ukraine's great nationalist leaders were, sort of post-World War I, the short-lived Ukrainian Republic was led by people who fomented and carried out pogroms against the Jewish population there. Even Zelenskyy gives out a medal, to soldiers who performed heroically with the name of Khmelnytsky, the Cossack leader who massacred Jews in 1648. There's a lot of disconnects here. And it all adds up to a sort of strange mix of sort of toxic ideology and toxic expectations that has put Israel in the crosshairs of Ukrainian pressure and international pressure, when there's no rational basis for it to do so otherwise.
I thought it was interesting that the Ukrainian defense minister at one point made the argument that Israel should intervene because of there's Jewish cultural and historical sites there that are being destroyed by Russian suicide drones and missiles. And well, don't they want to protect that? But when you do look at the actual history of the Jewish people in Ukraine, it's much more complicated, as you point out.
Yes, it is. And obviously, Israel and world Jewry, every decent person would like to see, Jewish sites in Ukraine preserved, would like to see this war end. But, without getting into a sort of another, it's another question. It's not clear to me that sort of, encouraging Zelenskyy to fight to the finish rather than negotiate an end to this war will actually do much to protect the Ukrainian people, let alone the Jews there or Jewish sites.
Right. So David Wormser also surmised that in the early stages of the war, the Biden administration may have pushed Ukraine to pressure Israel as a way to put Israel on the defense, making it less able to thwart the U.S. rejoining the JCPOA. That's the Iran nuclear deal. If that's the case, Ukraine would be simply continuing the path that was laid out by the U.S. early in the war. And Kiev's ambassador to Israel made a joke last week that the U.S. is Ukraine's, quote, secret weapon because they have been continually turning to the U.S. to pressure Israel to assist in the war. And he claimed he meets weekly with Tom Nides, our ambassador to Israel, on the topic. The Biden administration, however, at least overtly seems to be standing by Israel's sovereign right to make its own military decisions. Would that they do the same with Israel when it comes to the Palestinian conflict, but that's a separate issue. Do you think there's anything going on behind the scenes involving U.S. pressure on Israel, or do you believe that Biden truly supports Israel's decision in this matter? And do you think that the U.S. allowing Israel to be autonomous is an indication that they realize the Iran nuclear deal is dead?
Well, those are complicated questions. I think the Biden administration is very ambivalent about this. I think, to its credit, it has not tried to publicly pressure Israel on this, and it has continued in that, in sort of not trying to beat up Israel because it didn't get further involved in this war, transfer its technology or its arms there. That's I have to give Biden, he's done a lot of things that are wrong, and certainly his attitude towards Israel and the whole Iran issue is terrible. but that was correct. Does Biden want to silence Israel? Of course it has. Although for a year, the Bennett-Lapid government was very quiet on Iran and basically doing Biden's bidding on that. Obviously, that's about to change with Benjamin Netanyahu becoming prime minister again. He's going to be a vocal critic of U.S. policy on Iran, as he should be in defending, and he's going to be hoping to cooperate with what are likely to be Republican majorities in the House and the Senate next year to obstruct further appeasement of Iran. Iran is sort of a wild card in this because Iran is involved on behalf with its partner Russia, because they are partners in Syria. There is, the U.S., there's a lot of cognitive dissonance at the White House and in the State Department about what to do about Iran. Because on the one hand, the foreign policy priority of the Biden administration has been appeasement of Iran, trying to entice them to return to the weak and dangerous nuclear deal from 2015, which, will not prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. It will guarantee it will get a nuclear weapon. At the same time, Biden has embraced the cause of Ukraine, is treating Russia as the United States chief foe, stripping our defenses in order to fight it, when in fact China is actually America's most deadly foe. It's not happy about Iran. And in fact, it would like to, it was hoping to conclude a nuclear deal with Iran to get Iranian oil flowing. Iranian oil has been embargoed, to get Iranian oil flowing to the West so as to reduce the price of gas and to reduce the pressure on Europe that has resulted from Western sanctions on Russia, which are entirely justified from a moral point of view, but as a practical matter, have done more damage to the West than they've done to Russia. The Biden clearly, I wouldn't, as much as I want to give credit for not trying to pressure Israel too much, but Biden doesn't seem to know what he's doing about Iran, nor is his foreign policy team know what they're doing, because on the one hand, they're all over, the idea of becoming friends with Iran again, a rapprochement with Iran, and yet Iran is aiding, the demon Putin, and a part of a war where the United States is all in. So the United States doesn't know what to think about Iran, and it's in no position to pressure Israel to, compromise its security on that way too. So, that's why its position has been so incoherent.
Which is this is a good transition to my next question, which is that one of the other accusations that Zelensky has been making is that Israel's responsible for the Moscow-Tehran alliance, and that had Israel provided Ukraine with the defensive weapons it's been requesting, that Russia-Iran alliance would never have come to pass. But given that Russia and Iran have a history of working together, including on the Iranian nuclear program, is that a fair accusation? And, again, I'll add, what about the U.S.? Hasn't it enabled this alliance to grow by its inaction and slow walking of assistance to Ukraine? I don't see the U.S. sending our own defensive weapon systems like Patriot missiles to Ukraine. So why is this frightening alliance? And I do find it frightening given Zelensky saying that Russia is actually helping Iran advance its nuclear program in exchange for Iran providing the drones. So why is this, why is it only Israel's fault with this alliance? And the final thing I'll add to this is that Shoshana Bryan, our mutual friend, wrote a good article also on the topic, pointing out that Zelensky hasn't blamed the U.S. for the Iran nuclear negotiations brokered by Russia, which allowed Russia and Iran to sit together as allies in Vienna. Again, a U.S., that's the U.S. So what do you think about this?
The notion that Israel is the reason why Iran and Russia are allies, it's so stupid, it's so ahistorical, it's so completely contrary to the facts. You don't know whether to laugh or cry about it. I mean, where does anybody get the nerve to make such a completely false accusation? Iran and Russia have been allies for a decade. They've been working closely together militarily in Syria. And they, Russia and Iran have been involved with each other. Russia has been supplying Iran with sophisticated air defense systems. which worried Israel because it made it, the prospect, right now, the unlikely, unfortunately, prospect of Israel or the West being able to sort of take out Iran's nuclear program, much less likely. Yes, it's also supplied some help. Russia would like Iran to be a threshold nuclear state. It doesn't want them to actually have a bomb, probably. Russia is a signatory to the JCPOA, but, they've been totally involved with each other. And yes, if you're going to look for a foreign power that was responsible for this, other than Moscow and Tehran, it's Washington. It was President Obama's decision to not enforce his red line about the Syrian use of chemical weapons against its own people, when he basically punted responsibility for dealing with that issue to Russia, inviting Russia to take in, putting sort of the kosher stamp of approval from the United States on Russia's military intervention in a civil war in which it committed atrocities against the Syrian people alongside Assad and the Iranians. So this is completely contrary to the facts. Bringing Israel into this is just scapegoating Israel. I mean, granted, Zelenskyy sometimes talks as if history began like a year ago. He doesn't really, I mean, he's been an inspiring, obviously, military leader. Ukraine, has defended itself far more than anybody thought they would. He and his, khaki T-shirt have become a symbol of resistance against Russia. There's much to praise in what he's done in the last year. But, he came into these issues, sort of as a blank slate. He was a comedian, a TV actor, and he has no knowledge, he has no in-depth knowledge of these issues. He knows very little about Israel, very little about the Middle East. He's just, not to put too fine a point on it, he's, BSing the world on this. And, it's making Israel a scapegoat. It's like convenient shorthand. It's the easiest trope to reach out to. It has nothing to do with the facts here. And I think anybody who knows anything about these issues, this is just risible. It should be dismissed out of hand.
Yeah, I mean, not to belabor our earlier point, but, unfortunately, it's not just Zelenskyy, it's U.S. lawmakers also who lack a complete understanding of the—
Yes, the Chris Murphys and the Adam Kinzingers of the world have as firm a grasp on, the Middle East as Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and that's not a compliment.
So there have been some individuals who have suggested that Iran is using the Ukrainian war as a testing ground for a future war it will have with Israel. In fact, multiple reports indicate that Iranian military experts have been deployed to Crimea to assist Russian forces with launching these drone strikes on civilian targets. And an Israeli brigadier general suggested that Iranians, quote, will return differently from Ukraine to the Israeli battlefield. They are preparing for war. I could see an argument being made that perhaps Israel could also use this as a test run for war with Iran and therefore should engage in helping Ukraine militarily. But on the other hand, Israel doesn't want to give away any strategies and military secrets it would use in a future confrontation with Iran, and will certainly need its own defensive weaponry, as we discussed in any future conflicts. What are your thoughts on this whole idea that Iran is using this as a testing ground?
Well, of course it is. I mean, it is, by being involved in a war, it's testing its capabilities, it's seeing what works, what doesn't work. The truth is, the Russia-Ukraine war is the first, large scale land war in Europe, in nearly 80 years. So everybody's doing that. Obviously the Russians, are testing their capabilities and have been found wanting. The Ukrainians turned out to be stronger than expected, but the West, the United States, the Pentagon is kind of doing the same thing. I'm not sure if it's necessarily completely in America's interest to strip its own defenses in order to arm Ukraine, but it's kind of a proxy war in that sense. And I think, people in the Pentagon are watching closely, are observers on the ground there, American, forces there who have been training the Ukrainians and watching this. They're taking notes too. This is going to be used as fodder for, military studies for the next generation until there's another war. Everybody's sort of playing this, and certainly the Israelis are paying close attention too to all of this, as they should, because this is sort of a grand experiment in warfare. There's something, and to be honest, one of the arguments that has been sort of one of the more rationalist as opposed to romantic arguments for America's all-in attitude on Ukraine was that by propping up the Ukrainians and by keeping the war going on their hand, we were in essence bleeding Russia white. The Russian military is in theory a threat to NATO and NATO countries, sort of debasing their military capabilities is in the West's interest. If Russia's military is drained and sort of weakened, that is in America's military strategic interest. I wouldn't deny that. But there's something deeply cynical about the idea of sort of fighting this war as sort of a military experiment, playing with all these these high-tech toys, these missiles, these defense systems, seeing how they all work. America has been all in and giving Ukraine intelligence, real-time intelligence to helping them attack Russian forces. Ukraine has, attacked targets inside, and even carried out a terrorist attack, killed the daughter of one of Putin's cronies inside Russia. It's sort of like, as was said in the late 19th century, of the rivalry between Britain and Russia along the border between Afghanistan and the Russian Empire. It's the great game being played out. And every military power, including Israel, is paying close attention to it. But as much as I want to see Russia degraded, I don't want to see Russia win. I want to see American strategic as well as Israeli strategic interests advance. The idea of continuing this war ad infinitum, indefinitely, with no exit ramp, just so that the military powers can test their weapons and their capabilities, seems to me to be deeply immoral and irresponsible. The United States should be more open, and more vocal about seeking diplomacy here, because there is no complete victory for Ukraine. Ukraine is not going to completely defeat a nuclear power. I mean, they've held their own, and good for them. And we praise them, and that's a good thing. But the idea that Ukraine is going to drive the Russians out of Crimea or parts of eastern Ukraine, where actually there are a lot of Russian speakers who may be sympathetic to the Russians, and something that would be viewed as a direct threat to the Putin regime, or even regime change in Moscow, that's not a humanitarian interest. A war to the death in Ukraine doesn't really serve anybody. It certainly doesn't serve the interests of the Ukrainian people or the Russian people. We should be looking for a way to get out, to end this war, not to keep fighting it indefinitely, and especially not to be testing high-tech military toys.
Right. And as we discussed, and our mutual friend Shoshana Bryant pointed out, that if Israel were to lose just one Iron Dome battery, to its key enemy, which would give it access to the technology that protects Israel from Iran's proxies, it would be horrific.
It would be crazy. That would be a crazy thing to do. And Israel's leader, Israel can sometimes be a crazy country in some ways. It's not that crazy. And for Americans or American Jews to expect it to do something that crazy just shows how disconnected they are from the reality of Israel's strategic necessities.
So that's a good transition into one of the I'm going to turn to the audience questions right now. And one of the people asked, why do American Jews feel that Israel has to go all in when the U.S. or the EU have not gone all in?
Yeah, it's a crazy double standard. Certainly, the United States has not given the Ukrainians everything they want. You pointed out rightly that they haven't given them Patriot missiles, but they've given them a lot. American armed forces have been stripped of weapons to feed into the Ukraine, to feed the cost of this war. The United States has already committed, I think, nearly $60 billion to keep Ukraine afloat. In order to keep them fighting the war, we're going to have to keep, that's just a down payment on what could be tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars more in the coming months and years. Something that I think the Republican majorities in Congress will be looking at, although clearly many Republicans think this is a good idea. Senate minority, perhaps soon to be majority leader Mitch McConnell certainly seems to think so. But I think expecting Israel to do even more than the United States, I think expecting Israel to do as much as the United States when it has its own strategic relationship and strategic needs vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis the Jewish population in Russia is entirely unreasonable. And I think American Jews who make these calls upon Israel really don't understand the issue. I think they're not fully cognizant of the factors that are involved there. And I think they've to the romanticization of the war, and they bought into the idea that Israel is some kind of military superpower, that it can, intervene in foreign wars, rather than understanding that it has all it can do to defend itself.
Yeah, so someone pointed out that there should be some nuance here, and that there's lots of ways that Israel can line up with the right side and support Ukraine. And what I'm wondering is, we've already touched on the fact that Israel's provided humanitarian aid. They're now providing the intelligence on the suicide drones and the alert system that they're helping Ukraine with. So do you think that they're sort of caving into the pressure, or are they doing this out of their own self-interest or the moral right thing to do?
I think the Israeli government has tried to chart a middle ground. It did not wish to be associated with Russia or the Russian invasion, rightly so. It's a terrible thing. It rightly, sort of sent humanitarian aid, for which it doesn't seem to get any credit. And it has done some things to help the Ukrainians. It offered the Ukrainians an early warning system, and Zelenskyy said no. So I think Israel, I don't think it's giving in. I think Bennett and Lapid, for all of their sort of pliability vis-a-vis Biden on other issues, I think they understood that they could not sort of endanger Israel in this way. I don't think there's any chance that Benjamin Netanyahu will do any differently. He will sort of sound the moral. He will make the same noises about supporting Ukraine's cause, but he will not sort of endanger, Israeli security for the sake of Ukraine, nor should he. And I don't think anybody voted for him to do that. So I don't think it's true that Israel's giving in. I think Israel would have been very happy to have no involvement with this at all. But I think certainly within Israel itself, there was a lot of support for the idea of humanitarian aid and taking in refugees and sort of taking some steps to help the Ukrainians. But I don't think there's any groundswell for getting involved in a foreign war. Because I think that Israelis have a much better grasp of their own situation than many Americans do.
Yeah. Someone asked, you mentioned an equivocal relationship between Israel and Russia, her neighbor. What about Israel's other neighbors and her interests in preserving the Abraham Accords and its relationship with the Saudis?
Well, that's entirely true. Israel's much more interested, as it should be, in preserving its alliances, its newfound alliances within the Arab world, with the countries that signed the Abraham Accords, and with Saudi Arabia, which is a tacit ally. It didn't sign, it hasn't normalized relations with Israel, but it gave the okay for other countries to do so. And, it has very close under the table relations with Israel. That is Israel's priority. It should be. It should have been the priority of the Biden administration to expand the Abraham Accords. It is not, unfortunately. They were more interested in pursuing appeasement of Iran, which is why one of the reasons why the Arab states have looked to Israel as an ally against Iran. So I think Israel's priority will remain that. As to how the Ukraine war has impacted that, I think, Biden came into office saying terrible things about the Saudis, pointing out their human rights abuses and, bashing it right and left because they saw them as close, like Israel, close with the Trump administration. And now they're surprised that the Saudis don't think that it should be, they should, bend over backwards to help the United States, by producing more oil in order to help them, fight the war against Russia and Ukraine. I think the Saudis are completely disinterested in this war in Europe. They're worried about the way, the threat that Iran poses to them. They're worried about their own security, their own economy. And the Biden administration has completely botched the relationship with Saudi Arabia. And that has played a part. And I think they want Israel to pressure the Saudis to sort of help out here. And I don't think Israel has any power to do so, even if it wanted to. So again, this is just a tremendous disconnect from reality, and says more about the incompetence of the Biden administration than anything else.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm just looking through the last couple of questions. We have probably time for one more. And our friend Claire Lopez. Claire, thank you for listening in, as you always do. Given the increasing level of Iranian support, drones, missiles to Russia for use in Ukraine, how does this add complexity to Israeli considerations?
Well, Iran is a strategic and a direct threat to Israel. And its missile capabilities, which is in a sense as dangerous as its nuclear program, are really part of Israel's sort of perilous strategic equation. It's why it's wanted to maintain freedom of operations in Syria, which the Russians let them, so as to ensure that Iran wasn't setting up missile batteries facing them in southern Syria to complicate Israel's own strategic situation. Now, Iran is testing and using, flexing its military muscles right now in Ukraine, helping the Russians, hoping to get the Russians to be even more supportive of them. That's obviously problematic for Israel, but it's not clear to me that problem is going to be solved by more Israeli intervention against the Russians there. This is an ongoing strategic problem for Israel, and there's no way to talk ourselves out of this. If you want to do something about the threat that Iran poses to the region, to the peace of the world, then maybe our focus should be less on fighting, perpetuating the war in Ukraine, as much as we want Ukraine to be able to maintain its independence. Maybe we should be focusing on helping the protesters in Iran and giving them vocal support, and making clear that the world will not enrich and empower the oppressors in Tehran, which will make it easier for them to shut down the protests, the women who don't want to wear hijabs, the workers who don't want to be oppressed there. That should be the focus of American foreign policy, not appeasement, not empowerment, not opening the floodgates, for, Western wealth to pour into Iran, which will just make the regime stronger, make the Iranian people more oppressed, and frankly, make Iran more capable of spreading its terrorist capabilities and its terrorist forces and its missile forces elsewhere in the world. You want to stop Iranian military adventurism, get rid of the Iranian regime, or at least help those who are trying to do so. That doesn't seem to be a priority for Washington, and that is a disgrace.
And that is a good note on which to end. I urge everybody watching to follow jns.org to get the newsletters that Jonathan sends out daily with brilliant, insightful articles. And please follow Jonathan's brilliant articles themselves, because you do write on all sorts of topics, and I always learn something from reading you. So thank you all for joining this afternoon. Jonathan, thank you a million. I know that you're busy with commentary on the election, and I look forward to hearing your insights on that as well. So
thank you so much.
Good afternoon. Okay.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. And thank you to everybody who tuned in.